Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, before we were moms, we had moms.
Yep.
And those moms have a lot to say. And it's been 4 years in the making to get to the point where we were ready to share their wisdom with the world. So, who better to voice all the feelings they have, all the child rearing theories, all the lived experiences than our moms themselves?
And you've heard some of their wisdom through our mouths, right? Because we will share some of their golden nuggets. But I think it's particularly special to hear their thoughts, their memories, their insights. And I have to say, they were pretty ahead of their times in a lot of ways, and really thoughtful and deliberate and engaged as parents. And it's really fun. It's a really beautiful episode.
It also should make every person who's listening feel just a little bit better when they hit roadblocks and hurdles in their relationships with their kids. Because we all know, but you will hear over the next 45 or 50 minutes about how those things that made us a little bit crazy when we were growing up were not ill intended. They were really, by and large, either very purposeful in an attempt to keep us safe, to keep us healthy, to make us happy, or our parents were screwing up and they were recognizing their mistakes and they were trying to take do-overs. And so, given what we preach on this podcast and through all the work that we do, it kind of helps to listen to the look back version.
Mm-hmm.
And it helped me to have this conversation, actually.
And if you listen till the end, you'll hear my signature getting choked up and crying as I thank our mothers.
Goes there.
I go there. Yes. Crowls are criers. Bennett's are criers. So we hope you enjoy, and we hope you share it with a parent or parent figure in your life who taught you a lot, because our moms definitely taught us a lot. Well, this is a very exciting moment in the history of our podcast, because Cara, who is sitting directly in front of us on Zoom?
It's our two moms. If you're watching on YouTube, you see them.
Yes.
If you're not watching on YouTube, this might be a great episode to go watch on YouTube, so you get the visual of what is happening here.
And if you see the visual, you will see two spectacularly beautiful, elegant, poised women. But what you don't see, but will hear over the next hour, are two spectacularly intelligent, insightful, and loving women. So we are honored to have you both here. Thank you for being our mothers, first of all.
For birthing us. Thank you for having us, moms.
And thank you for coming on the podcast. You guys can say,
this is where you're allowed to say.
I'm really excited to do this.
We're going to start with a bunch of questions. We're going to cover as much as we can. God willing, you will both come back for future episodes. But in the meantime, we are going to get started with a little bit of background, but I want you to keep the background tight, because we're going to get to the juicy stuff after we get to the background. So, Liz, I'm going to start with you. For listeners who don't know, Liz is Cara's mom and Lynn is my mom. And so I will start with Liz because Cara knows the answer to these questions. Okay, Liz, so where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in London and we moved to Los Angeles when I was 4. And I then grew up in Beverly Hills.
And what were your teenage years like? And I know this could be a whole episode, but we're going to keep it tight.
Don't leave out the award you won in high school, Mom.
Okay, I had very strict British parents. So my teenage years weren't very exciting. I mean, there were so many rules, and I was not a rule breaker. So, I was with friends. I had curfews. But the highlight is we did travel back to England twice during my teenage years and connected with family. And those connections still exist, which is really wonderful.
Okay, I have to chime in. We went through your journals. Remember that a couple of years ago?
Oh, that
from
was
those
one
trips?
of the rules. I had to keep travel journals.
It was the best rule ever because that is the juiciest read. I mean, you and Talia and I just sat there pouring
And laughed.
It was amazing. Can you just do 1 second on you have always been very stylish, Mom, and you in high school were awarded the
Well,
what was
wait,
your
you
award?
need a little background.
Okay.
My parents were very strict, and I had a budget of, I think it was $70 a month. And that included clothes and going out with friends. And believe it or not, I was voted best dressed girl at Beverly High.
I think we're going to sense a theme here, Liz. Which to be voted best dressed at Beverly High is no small feat. That is no small feat. Okay, Mom, we're going to get back to some other questions with Liz, but Mom, Lynn, if you would just talk about where you grew up and what your teenage years were like.
I started out growing up in Dobbs Ferry, which is a small town on the Hudson suburb of New York City. My life changed when my parents got divorced when I was about 8.5. And so I traveled and walked two paths. I stayed in the suburbs trying to be a nice suburban girl. And on the weekends, lived with my father, who was an artistic bent and took his avocation in the 50s was modern dance. You can imagine what that was like. He went to the Beaux-Arts ball dressed as Yul Brynner and shaved his whole body. And so I was exposed to an artistic world, and we went to the Museum of Modern Art every weekend and took painting and saw dance on Saturday nights. And during the week, I couldn't have been more typical as a suburban teenage girl in a small high school where I was in the minority, not only as a Jew, and my parents didn't care about being Jewish, so there was no community connection there, but also it was either very upper class lawyers and country club people, and then blue collar, mostly Italian immigrants. And then there was this little strip in the middle of people like us who didn't really fit anywhere. I loved my teenage years.
Well, just tell people quickly what happened in your teenage years that shifted the reality.
My mother remarried. So for my junior and senior year, I assume that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
We moved to White Plains. I went from a class of about 80 kids to a class of about 800, 700, 800. And instead of it being something that I was scared of or didn't welcome or resisted, I was thrilled because I had grown up with these kids from the time I was born to the end of my sophomore year. And, kids have pretty firm sense of who somebody is. And it's very hard to break out of other people's perceptions of who you are. But by moving, I was able to, in a sense, reinvent myself, to explore things differently, to present a different persona to the world, perhaps something that was in there. It became an opportunity to also kind of integrate the two sides of who I was, because there was much more diversity in White Plains High School, where I ended up graduating, with the medal in Spanish, which my mother got from Samuel Tilden High School, and your sister, Vanessa, got from Rye Country Days. So 3 generations of women got the Spanish achievement.
It's not best dressed at Beverly Hills High School, but it's something.
Well, it was best. It was actually best looking. I shared with my friend Sue Gardella. Pretty amazing.
There
right?
you go.
There you go. If anyone was wondering our genetic origin story, there you have it.
Which I never believed, but it was a nice thing to get.
Before we move past your formative years, will you both tell us, and Lynn, maybe you can start, how old were you when you got married?
I was a couple of months shy of 25 when I got married. So September, I turned 25 in December, and I was considered past my prime, my husband and I I don't think we went to another wedding of any of our friends after that. I was among the last, if not the last of all my cohort.
And Mom?
I was 19. And the reason was that Kara's dad proposed in the summer between my freshman and sophomore years. I went on a student tour to Europe, and he showed up, and which the chaperones did not approve of.
There's lots written about it in the diaries. Let me just tell you.
And proposed on a gondola in Venice. However, we weren't going to get married until I graduated college 3 years later. However, we came home, and about a month afterwards, President Kennedy stood up and said, "You're only exempt from the draft if you're married." And Vietnam was gearing up, and everyone who was going together got married. And so I think, Lynn, our generation was very influenced by Vietnam, civil rights, and all of the social justice movements that were going on at the time.
Very much so.
So we'll get back to that point, Liz, in a little while, because I want to explore that as you think about your relationship with your grandchildren. But we're going to do a little archaeology here about how and when and if anyone talked to you about puberty and sex, because you produce 2 daughters who talk about puberty and sex and teenagers for a living. So it would be very interesting for our listeners to know the origin stories of our mothers before we delve a little deeper in the topic. Liz, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay. My mother was very British and very reserved. I think she gave me a book, and that was about it. So I swore I was going to be a different kind of mother, but the times were different too. And I think that's an important part, because I don't think in the late 50s that parents talked freely to children on the way that they did in the 70s and 80s.
And did you have any health class in school? Was there any kind of formal? Do you remember?
Yes. And it was in 6th grade. And the teacher was Mr. Late. And he was very embarrassed teaching this. So the deal was that on the last day of school, we could ask him any question about his life that we wanted to.
The original Ask Me Anything. Do you remember anything juicy from that day?
I remember him blushing a lot and skirting the answers.
Wow, that is a bold move with a bunch of 11 and 12-year-olds in a room.
Yes.
And Liz, did your parents ever talk to you about sex or relationships or anything like that? Or you just remember getting the book?
I don't think they ever talked to me. I'm trying to think. They just assumed I was a good girl, and that was it. They would talk about other people and, if they had sex and what would happen to your reputation, and everyone would talk about you, but never a direct conversation.
Mom, what about you? Do you remember, did your parents talk to you about sex?
I remember when I was very late getting my starting menstruation, and when I got my period, I was home, fortunately, and I ran and told my mom, Mom, guess what? She said, "Oh, that's nice, dear." For me, she always said, "Dear."
Yes, dear.
being late was hard. And, all the memories of gym class.
How old were you, Lynn?
14.
I was 14 and a half.
Wow.
14. I was 14. Vanessa is the outlier on this.
I'm the outlier by being the exact average age that people got their periods in the 1980s. I was 12.9 months old.
So, Lynn, just a funny little anecdote about that. In gym class, you had something called a blue slip that you could fill out if you had your period, and then you were excused from gym. Well, I was so embarrassed that I was the only girl that I was planning on faking the blue slip.
Mm-hmm. And I have an opposite story. When I was a freshman in college, we had to take a sport, and I chose golf. It was across campus, I don't know, 2-3 miles, it felt like. And I was always sleepy because I stayed up too late. And I didn't like the golf. And the teacher was an old guy, probably much younger than I, but at the age of 18 or 17 at the time, he felt very old. But you would get excused, exactly the same thing if you had your period. And he didn't realize that you didn't get your period twice a month. So I would say, I couldn't come. So I got my period. So I finally got my period. I finally developed breasts. And I don't remember having a health class. I do remember being petrified as I got older of getting pregnant. I remembered thinking making out was great fun. And I think now about how long we could just kiss and sit in the car, and not do much else. And I remember always making sure I had my bra on and tight, all of those things. But mostly it was being afraid of getting pregnant. My mother's bias, my mother's approach was always, I want to do justice to her history, but it was just be careful. I think that was it. I interviewed for a temporary job after freshman year or sophomore year in college. And then the guy who ran the office asked me out. And I said, yeah, sure. I really was a little dumb, I think. And I went out, and then, of course, he tried something. I mean, I came home in tears, and I went into my mother's bedroom, and I said, oh, blah, 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 this is what happened. She said, well, what did you expect? So it was that kind of attitude. Men were out for something. It was not about your pleasure. It was about what they wanted and how they were going to use you, which I don't know about you, Liz, but it made me think about, on a subconscious level, how do I use sexuality and attractiveness for my purposes? I regret now that I didn't use it better. I regret now that I didn't use it more, but I was aware of the dynamic.
Liz, when you think about, because Cara's been doing this work even longer than I have, right? It's now Care and Keeping, you updated 25 years ago.
No.
Oh, sorry. The original came out 25 years ago.
Original came out. But, the pediatric stuff started almost 30 years ago. I started my training in 1997. So I've been in this world a long time.
But the sort of puberty royalty, which is how I refer to Cara, and then all the subsequent downstream effects. So when she started doing this work, did you think to yourself, I wonder why my daughter is like taking this path? Or, oh, I know exactly why she took this path. Here are the qualities about her that it doesn't surprise me that she's doing it. What was your reaction?
I was never surprised. When she was maybe 8 or 9 years old, she wanted to be a geneticist. And then maybe by the time she was going to summer camp and was doing leadership, she said, I want to be a doctor for teenage girls. So that was always her interest.
That's so interesting. I did not know that. See, this is why we need you guys to come on the podcast so we can learn stuff about each other.
And I will say that I would always describe myself as not knowing what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. But, you say a set of things to your parents, and then you sort of go through these exercises with all your friends and the outside world, and how you present your interests change. And it's so interesting to me that what I presented to you, Mom, is the thing I ended up doing. And out in the rest of the world, I tried on all these different personas. I thought you were going to say you weren't surprised because the first time you let me babysit my little brother, I showed him the video, Where Did I Come From?, which was like a new release on VHS. And you were not happy with me. And you were not happy with me because, and I remember you said this to me, you wanted to show him that video and talk to him about it.
Wow. 2 moms.
He is 9 years younger. So he was really the baby.
He was the baby. He had two. He was the baby for everyone. Mom, are you surprised? I mean, you have a particularly fascinating situation because you have two children who work in the puberty industry, Nick with Big Mouth and me with everything Cara and I do. Does it surprise you that we do this work?
I remember saying it must be because I did everything wrong that both of you are in this work. But you said no, and Nick said no. So that was so relieving to hear. All you kids, all four, took different paths to where you've ended up. And so I never started out with a sense of this is what you were going to do, this is what you should do, this is what I want you to do. It was always a question of you're finding your own path. And you did civil, you were in the Justice Department before this, and then at a nonprofit. So I think going from the Justice Department to a nonprofit and going into puberty work is a very natural path to have taken.
Made a lot of sense. There was the Dynamo Girl stop for a long time in between, which helps make it more sense.
Well, but now that you said that, you have always been very clear about who you wanted to be and the person you wanted to be, and that you were comfortable, I think most of the time, showing your strength, and that you've been very clear that the path you were going to take is the path that you yourself were going to define. So it's an outgrowth of Dynamo Girls, because it became very clear with Dynamo Girls that there's a lot more to do to teach and help girls do in their development.
So, Lynn, I don't know if you know this, but Vanessa is an honorary doctor. She knows everything at this point about
I just bypass medical school. It's fine.
I mean, yes, it's very logical. So you made a comment about 4 kids. I think it's a good moment to acknowledge that you each had 4 children. Vanessa and I are both the third of the 4. We do not think there is a coincidence there that we get along so well, given that we are both thirds. But that's we can't stop talking about it. So our regular listeners know very well our birth order. But let's talk a little bit about parenting, which when you guys did it was not a verb. But Lynn, I want to start with you. What was your favorite stage of parenting?
This is going to sound sappy. I love them all. I've always felt that being a parent, having children, being a mom, and I made being a parent my primary commitment. Being a mom was what I wanted to do. It's like reading the greatest book, and each chapter there's something new going on. And when you're no longer trying to mold, it's very exciting to see, okay, what's going to happen next? Who's this person going to be? It's a little bit like reading a book. What's going to happen in the next chapter? Where is this person going to go? Which isn't to say that it's hands-off parenting, but for me, it's always been exciting to get to know the emerging children, the emerging people that came out of each stage. So I really loved every stage.
Did you get better at it? Did you change? Did you evolve and change? We always talk about the first pancake, that poor firstborn who's just like
which neither of us is.
No, clear. I mean, right, there we go. But do you think, while your love of it extended throughout, did your skill shift over time? Or were your kids all different and it was stretched out over a long enough period of time that you were just adapting to the needs of the moment?
I think your skills shift as you learn what works for you and what works within the dynamics of your family. And every child, even with the same parents, is born into a different family because there are already dynamics. As you say, you're the third. And a side note, by the way, is that my husband and I are both first children. Most of our friends are either first children or second children, but 6 or 7 years later. And if you start looking around at your friends, you will find that frequently it is paired up, first kids with first kids, or third with, or second, in Nessa's case, third with second. Anyway, so yeah, skills evolve. And each child requires, I think, a different style of parenting. Each child has different needs, and you have to pay attention and respond to those needs as best you can, making all the mistakes in the world that everybody will.
Liz, what about you? Did you have a favorite stage of parenting?
Well, my parenting trajectory was rather interesting. I think, like Lynn, I loved every stage, but somehow I just flashed back on something I did when my first child was 18 months old. we took a class by a Dr. Thomas Gordon called Parent Effectiveness Training.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember that book?
Oh, yes, I remember taking an offshoot of that. Yeah.
Okay. And so many of the people in the class had teenagers, and they had nothing left to do but take the car keys away. And basically, he taught us ways of communicating that would be effective. Now, whether I always did them, not so sure, but it was really interesting to be in that class with parents of children of different ages and realizing that having some tools early on was very beneficial. So,
how many people in the country do you think took the parent effectiveness training? And do we think it's a coincidence that our two mothers both took this class in
our two firstborn mothers?
I mean, it's kind of fascinating. If there was a psychologist on here, they would do a deep dive on Cara and my life trajectory based on that.
Mom, will you talk just for a second about your trajectory through parenting was unique. Can you just give a quick overview of how it shifted from your firstborn to raising your fourthborn?
Okay. So my first three children were within 36 months. So I was a very young mom because after Kennedy stood up and said you were only exempt by being married, a year later, he stood up and said you were only exempt if you had children. So it was 1, 2, 3, and 2 boys, 22 months apart, and then Cara 15 months later. And in an intact family with, I would say, a lot of privilege, a lot of publicity and exposure. 9 years after Cara was born, number 4 came along. And he was, this joyous little boy. But he didn't grow up in the same kind of environment that Cara and her 2 older brothers grew up in, because when he was 5 and Cara was 14 and her brothers were 15 and 17, Cara's dad and I got divorced. And along the way, I went back and finished college. So I always say, if people say, well, when did you go to UCLA? I think, God, if I tell them when I started, they're going to say, oh, she old. And if I tell them when I finished, they're going to say, not looking so good.
By the way, she was pregnant with my little brother, 9 months pregnant, going to UCLA to get her degree and getting asked out by undergrads. Let's just be super clear.
Oh, Liz.
Yeah. But it was, you're so thoughtful about explaining it because you went from having a big intact family to being a single mom and really.
And then working.
And working. Yeah.
Starting a business.
Yeah.
And from scratch and growing it and selling it to a public company. And then, continuing to work with my own company. So it's been a really interesting road. But what I really need to say is that without having my children needing a role model, I don't think I would have had the confidence to do all that. I mean, I would have been a terrible employee because there were all these kids. So I had to become an entrepreneur. And it was really the support of the kids that motivated me and helped me build a business. When Seth was 7 or 8 years old, he was designing advertising brochures for me.
So, Liz, that's a perfect segue to thinking about the age group we talk about most of all, which is tweens and teens. So, you were in a position where you needed to be a role model for your teenagers and a younger kid, and you needed to keep it together. And Mom, you were in an intact marriage, but you carried 95% of the parenting throughout our childhoods. And I'm wondering if you want to start, Mom, by talking about, because you're both really wonderful human beings, but I'm wondering if, when you think about what is your best quality as a parent of teenagers, because we're going to delve a little bit into the challenges and the wonderful aspects of raising. You both raised 4 teenagers in pretty tight succession. What was your best quality, Mom? What are you most proud of and how you handled those years?
I hope what the thread that runs through my parenting was a certain amount of consistency and dependability and predictability. People would say, "Why do you run meetings so well?" I said, "Well, I have 4 children. I operate well in organized chaos, and when you have 4 children, you need to have to set certain standards and provide your children with a certain amount of predictability." And I think the other thing that helped was that, as hard as my tween years were, and they were really hard, I still loved growing up, and I still find the complexity interesting. And it gave me a real comfort level with tweens and teens, because I remembered how interesting it was for me. And again, watching all of you change and navigate and try to fit into the skin you were hoping to inhabit, or create the skin that you wanted to inhabit. I found it really interesting.
What was the biggest lie I ever told you?
I can't say it on air.
Call me later, Lynn.
Do you want to just share with our listeners before Liz talks about her best parenting quality? Do you want to share with our listeners your trick about the come in and kiss me goodnight?
Oh, yeah. You all had curfews, and I was very firm about them. And before Uber, I always said, call if your ride is drunk, or if you're not ready to drive. I don't care if you wake me up. I'd rather be waking up than go to your funeral. Or I don't know if I said that, but that was certainly how I felt. And you had to come in and kiss me goodnight. And I could fall asleep. I was not one of these people that waited up pacing the floor. And so you come in and you kiss me goodnight. And the only one who thought he could really get away with it was your younger brother, who used to come in with brushed teeth. And of course, brushed teeth were trying to hide cigarettes and alcohol and whatever else he was putting in his mouth. But then I knew you were home, and then I could really go into a deep sleep. I mean, is that how you remember it? How do you remember it?
Yeah, but you were like a dog. It would be like we'd lean in to kiss you goodnight, and I'd hear, and I could hear the sniff test.
Oh, how funny. I don't remember that.
Okay, that's what I did all through my kids' high school, and to the point where Rye, when he was a senior in high school, would go, "I'm going to kiss you goodnight, but why don't you just sniff first?"
That is so wonderful. Ness, thank you for telling me that. I had forgotten.
Yeah, I think you thought you were being subtle, but also
the point was not to be subtle. The point was to let you know I was checking.
Liz, did you do a sniff test?
I didn't do a sniff test, but I think one of the things that I did, and what Lynn was saying about before Uber was interesting, is that I realized that it was kind of embarrassing if a child was in a social situation and was uncomfortable to call Mom to pick her up. So she
had one daughter, and we're going to use her as the pronoun.
Well, but wait, Greg and Anthony had the vouchers too. They just didn't.
It was the best move. You have to share it.
Yeah.
It was the best move.
So I got taxi vouchers. And the kids had taxi vouchers, so that if they were in a situation that was uncomfortable, they could get a ride home because calling mom to pick them up was not cool.
What a good idea.
And Kara used them a lot. Unfortunately, her big brothers didn't. And by the time Seth was a teenager, there were pagers.
Oh,
and
God, that's right.
I could page him to call me. And
Which he did not love. Let's just be very clear. If you don't want to call mom, you definitely don't want mom
to answer
paging you.
But he also had the taxi vouchers.
Yes, he did.
Liz, I'm so impressed with your resourcefulness. That was like creating an Uber situation before there was Uber.
It was a great idea.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Well,
An independent cab company. I'm going to do a little plug. Yeah. Yeah. So funny.
But I think the other thing, I tried to teach the kids, it's a pain to lie because you have to remember a lie. And then you can never tell it the same way because you can't remember it. But the truth you always remember. And punishment would always be for a lie. Because if you told the truth, you weren't going to be punished, whatever it was. But if you lied,
You know, as the kid in the situation, it was an interesting circumstance because my two older brothers were risk takers and I am not a risk taker. And my littlest brother is not a risk taker. I mean, it's a little bit of a generalization, but just not with our bodies and our brains in high school. We didn't push the bounds in that way. And it was insanely unfair to watch my two older brothers never get in trouble for any of their antics. But
they did.
But what they got in trouble for was lying about it. And the consistent through line was there. And it actually really influenced my parenting. You know, that I agree with you that honesty is everything and opening the lines of communication is everything. And so as a parent, I could appreciate what was going on in a way that as a kid, it was a bit lost on me, right? And I think that's the kind of stuff that we learn. We don't even know we're learning the lessons of how we want to raise our own kids until the shoe is on the other foot decades later.
Right.
And then you
So I'm curious, Nessa, I always said the same thing, Liz, which was truth. You will not get punished for the truth. But I'm not sure I made it as central and essential as you did. There's one thing I forgot to say about parenting, and that is to be able to pivot. That if you are inflexible and rigid, from my perspective, being that kind of parent is pretty hard on kids. And I think also hard on the parent. I mean, I think it takes strength to pivot and say, for this kid, it's okay, but for that kid, it may not be wise. That standards aren't one size fits all, except in certain things are non-negotiable, but in others, it's not one size fits all.
I think you have different expectations for each child, depending on that child's strengths, weaknesses, sensitivities. And I found having three all in that same stage at the same time was very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Liz, what was your favorite thing about teenagers? What did you appreciate or love about them?
I think doing things with them. I mean, I have.
Would you like to describe my after school routine with you?
Yes.
Go for it. I have not ever shared this. This is highly embarrassing. Go on.
Are you talking about the videos?
Oh, yes.
With friends?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So Cara would come home from school, and usually she would bring a couple of girlfriends, and we would put on the VCR and we would do Jane Fonda's workout together. And so
every day.
Okay.
Every day. Yes.
And I would work out with the girls. But
yes.
Funniest is that years later, we spent a lot of time in Sun Valley. And years later, we were in a restaurant, New Year's Eve in Sun Valley, and Kara's little brother was probably 4 years old. And Jane Fonda and her family came into the restaurant. And Kara's little brother, as we're leaving, walked up to her and said, "I know you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4."
That's wonderful.
But I mean, it's interesting that you say that, Liz. Not the Jane Fonda part. I actually have a funny Jane Fonda story, which I'll share with you later. But the doing stuff with your teenagers, and Mom, I don't know if you remember this story, so I'm going to tell the story, and then you'll probably say, "I don't remember saying that."
Oh dear.
But when I was pregnant with my fourth, and Liz, you can relate to this. And I was thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? Who can I ask? Oh, well, I'll ask my mom who had 4 children. And I called you and I said, Mom, and I think I was like days away or weeks away from giving birth. And I literally was like, what was I thinking? And I called you and I said, Mom, how did you do it? Like, how did you get through? You said, I don't know, dear. I honestly can't remember. You didn't say dear, but you said, I'm really not sure. And then I said to you, when does it get fun? When does it get good? And you said, well, when you all came home from college and we would drink wine and cook together, that was probably the best part. There I am, with nearly 4 kids under 7. I thought, oh my God, I've got to wait another 15 years. Do you remember saying that?
I do remember saying that. I probably could have come up with more instances of what was fun, I'm sure. But we were kind of close to that time. So that seemed most recent. But yeah.
Mom, what was your favorite part about raising teenagers?
I think what I said before, which was watching them and seeing them blossom and actually seeing you all negotiate and navigate the pitfalls, the challenges, seeing you succeed in them. And then in particular with a couple of you, when the academic side, I mean, you girls, I never had to worry about you academically. The boys hit their stride much later. And when that switch clicked, well, first of all, that was a big relief, but it also felt good. Okay, we've been doing it. Okay, the kids are what is that thing? The kids are okay.
Kids are all right.
The kids are all right. I never really worried about anybody not being right, but the stages, as you well know, everybody knows, they are challenging, each one of them. And when we did things together, for example, watching The Princess Bride all together. How many times did we watch it together? And how many times did we all know the lines? And for me, it was growing up in a family that got kind of split up with only one sister. When it felt like we were a team, when we felt like we were this teeny, strong, small community. And for me, I realized after that conversation that we'd had with all the grandchildren was the sense of belonging somewhere, the sense of feeling rooted somewhere. And I felt I belonged and I was rooted in this family.
It seems like we raised our kids with similar values and that we really enjoyed parenting. The difference that I see is that your kids grew up in a very safe, rather suburban environment. My kids were growing up in an urban environment where there were a lot of dangers. So one of the things that I was really focused on all the time was trying to keep them safe, especially as teenagers, everything that was going on in the community. And that was very different. And that was how I started sending them to summer camp in Maine for 8 weeks, because in that way, they would be somewhat safer in the summer and we could still travel before or after. But I think the real joy with a teenager is watching them evolve and helping them shape their values and listening to them and listening to their music and going to the movies with them and talking about it afterwards and all the things that you can experience together. And honestly, I felt I grew from the experience of parenting.
I do have a very vivid memory of driving with you when I was in high school and a Pat Benatar song came on the radio. And you were like, ooh, who's this? I like this song. And every time I hear that song, it's inevitably at Whole Foods because it's on their playlist. I always think about that. I want to pivot to grandparenting for a moment and talk about all of these lessons learned and experiences lived through parenting and how they have shifted in the form of grandparenting and how they have impacted grandparenting. And maybe, Mom, we can start with you. You're very connected to my kids, and you've spent not just a lot of time, but you spend a lot of energy working to build that connection. And it matters. It makes a big difference. And is there something about how you have connected with them that feels particularly significant? Is there any advice that you can offer other grandparents? Because I think you've really invested yourself in being an active grandparent in their life.
Thank you. First of all, I do want to add that one of the greatest joys of parenting is becoming a grandparent and watching your daughter parent her children. And I mean, one day you came to me and you said, "You're not going to believe what I'm doing that you did. And I'm telling my patients about." And I said, "What's that?" And you said, "Do you remember when we go to the market, if we wanted to buy something, we had to read the ingredients. And if we couldn't pronounce one of the ingredients, we couldn't buy it." And that was the way of keeping the house organic. So the great joy has been watching Cara parent. But I have found that I wanted to be very connected to her kids. And the best way to do it was to make sure that when I had the kids, I followed her rules. And sometimes I didn't agree with those rules, but I didn't want to risk her not being comfortable with my being with the kids. And I have found watching Talia and Rai develop has been extraordinary. I mean, Cara and Paul are great parents, but being able to be engaged in their life was very important to me. So a lot of times I will say to Cara, "Now, what's the next activity? When's Rai going to row? I'll be there." Well, you barely see him, and Cara will go, "He's going to be in a bad mood and won't talk to you afterwards." Well, I don't care. I want him to know I was there. Or just finding things to do with them that will be of interest and to make memories. I mean, doing mother-daughter grandma things with Cara and Talia, whether it's going to a spa or having a mani-pedi. And the other thing that I find I'm making more of a point of now as the kids are older is sharing with them what I did as a young adult, as a teenager, maybe, some of my passions for political involvement and
the journals. Sharing the journals was everything.
The journals. The journals were really great because I was, always the good one. But in the journals, I was able to write what I got away with. And
I think kids love seeing the other side of themselves. They love seeing you all their grandparents as full human beings. And as they get older, they can really appreciate who you are as independent and complete human beings with secret lives and memories and all of those things.
As a grandparent, one of the things that is challenging is you're not with the kid 24/7. So you really want to feel your way. What is that child's interest? What would that child like to do that would connect him or her to me? Asking them about their friends, meeting their friends. I mean, I think those are all things that I have found to be really wonderful.
Mom, what about you? How do you create connection?
It's no surprise that you and Cara are such good friends, because I can nod and say yes to almost everything Liz has said, that I share a lot of what you said. So I'll try not to repeat it. I never saw much of my grandparents, and my parents were rebels and did not want to be really central parts of their family. So I barely knew my grandparents. I knew a little bit of the master narrative of each of them. They were all were immigrants. So that lack drives me. That's part of what drives me to want to be known and to be part of my children's life. I remember, Nessa, when you gave birth to Samson, your first child, and you were living in this lovely apartment with a kitchen about the size of my screen, I think. And you didn't want anybody else, but you said, Mom, would you come and be my doula? And of course, heart be still. Why wouldn't I want to? But I was determined that this is before you could do a lot of takeout in New York, but I was determined that you would have very, very good food. So in this kitchen, the size of my screen, I was making veal piccata and meatballs from scratch. I mean, stuff I had given up ages ago, but I felt that you should have good food. So you were nursing Samson on the sofa and you said, Mom, I'm really hungry. So I got some food, and I don't know if you remember this. I fed you while you were nursing Samson. And I mean, even now that I get emotional, I get this nice warm feeling when I think about the privilege of being the mother to a mother who is feeding her grandchild, the transmission and the connection through generations. And in fact, neither you nor your sister had nurses, so I was able to participate in the beginning with both of you. I would echo just a few things that Liz said. One is to follow their interest. Do I really care about talking about football or soccer endlessly? No. Do I try to learn? Yes, I do. But I also want them to experience some of the things that matter to me. And because I really didn't know much about my grandparents and had to kind of put together a master narrative of the history of our family, I want my grandchildren to know me. Interestingly enough, there are times I feel freer to talk about myself with my grandchildren than I ever did with my children, in part because I'm not trying to shape things as much. There's a more relaxed feeling. Part of it is letting them in on some things I care about. Now, we've been fortunate that after each of the bar and bat mitzvahs, we've been able to take each grandchild on a trip. And without their parents, generally it's with my husband, Nessa's father, and I, but sometimes he can't go, so it's just me. I have a rule for each of those trips. Every day must include a cultural experience, a museum, an architecture tour, a history lesson, something that gives them a sense of the place and the history. Or museums are my big thing. They all do it. They all resent it until they can talk to me later about what mattered to them at the museum, which is so interesting. So it must include a cultural experience. It has to have good food, and there always has to be shopping. And if you can put those three things in a day with your grandchildren or yourself or your friends, it's a great day. And some of the kids have such accurate memories of what we did and what mattered to them. Even the ones that really didn't like museums. Your youngest, for example, Nessa, can talk about every museum we saw, every painting we saw. And what's lovely is they can remind me. I guess the privilege of being a grandparent is, again, to be invited into the people you love, into their life. And I agree with Liz that showing up, yeah, you go to a basketball game, you go to a soccer game, it's a sweaty kiss. Thanks for coming, Mima, and goodbye. But they know you showed up. They know that you care about them because you're there.
We could go on for hours, and God willing, you two will be back. I have no doubt by popular demand from our audience, because you are both so wise and wonderful, and you have so much more to share as we head into the Thanksgiving holiday next week.
Vanessa is getting teary. That's the pause. Hang on.
You only get
Take
to
a
see it
breath.
if you're watching on YouTube. If you're not watching on
that's-
YouTube, you can't see it.
That's a really good pitch for YouTube.
I feel so much gratitude, Liz, so much gratitude for you for raising your wonderful daughter, who I get to work with every single day, and so appreciate her. And Mom, so much for you. Thank you for being my mom.
It's my privilege to be your mom.
Well, and gratitude is what it's all about. And this world is upside down, and we all have to be grateful for what we have and to treat others with kindness and respect. It's so important.
Amen.
Amen to that.
We love you guys.
We love you, and thank you for giving us this opportunity.
And
imagine
really
your
fun.
children actually listening to you.
What I'm so excited about is I know there's a blast email that's going to follow this podcast going to all your friends saying, listen up, friends.
Was that a hint?
Listen up. Our children thank us in front of tens of thousands of people.
Well, but congratulations, Cara and Vanessa. You work so hard building this business.
Right.
And watching your success is a great thrill.
We had excellent role models, Liz. Thank you. Thank you for providing that to us. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.